Okay, good morning. Welcome to NUPI. Welcome to this seminar. This seminar is part of the Europe seminar series that we arranged. It's part of our EU-NOR research project in the Research Council of Norway, and also generously supported by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who support a series of lectures on Europe. So thank you so much to our sponsors. Let me also remind you that this seminar will be taped and streamed online, actually, or on YouTube, NUPI's TV channel. So please behave. Europe is at a critical stage, I believe. It's pressure from the outside and from the inside. Recently, we have seen the pressure from Russia, the instability in the Middle East, increasing the pressure on Europe. In addition to this, economic difficulties creates lots of tensions within Europe. This weekend we also saw the election in Greece, adding another kind of layer of challenges for Europe. So we are again reminded that even small states in Europe that is very much interdependent can trigger kind of destabilizing processes. And this brings us to the topic today, the role of small states in Europe. Many things could have been discussed, and hopefully we'll discuss many of these issues. But one thing is influence. Some argue that small states don't matter much in shaping the EU. The EU is a club of the larger states. However, there's quite a bit of research advocating a different position, that small states are very important in facilitating negotiations and also play a constructive role in balancing between larger member states. This is, of course, an issue that needs careful analysis and empirical studies. And we will probably hear more about this today. Another topic is the general policy orientation of small states and larger states. Since small states are unable to control their environment, they like to reduce uncertainty, and they like to typically prefer order and regulations rather than power politics. So it's generally assumed that small states have a stronger preference for European integration than the larger states. This is something that we would like to hear more about today, when Baldur is going to discuss on the general policy orientation of smaller states. Let me also say that this is a key topic in our EU-NOR research project, where we'd like to see what kind of role is Europe playing for smaller states in a Europe that is changing and in a new global order. We are very pleased today to have with us Baldur Thorhallsson, who is the head of faculty of political science. He's also a professor in the Jean Monnet Chair in European Studies, and he's also a program and a research director at the Center for Small States Studies at the Institute of International Affairs in Iceland. Baldur is a true expert on small states. He's also an expert on European politics, and recently he's also been involved in writing history of Iceland's foreign policy. One of the challenges of dealing with size, small states, larger states, is to kind of disentangle the concept. Norway, for instance, is a small state in population, but it's not so small if you compare sea area, for instance, and it's not so small if you look into energy or investments. The same could go with Luxembourg. It's a small state in many respects, but it's quite big in finance. So, and in addition, states can make use of different strategies to compensate for overcome some of their weaknesses, or turn weaknesses into strengths. And I think this is also a topic that Baldur will talk about today. So it's a pleasure to welcome Baldur. So the floor is yours.
Ulf, thank you very much. Pernilla and others here at NUPI, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here and to be in Oslo. Nice to get away from the snowstorm in Iceland. Wonderful weather here today. I'm going to talk about whether or not small states can have a say in the European Union. I'm going to focus on the challenges they face within the Union and what kind of measures they adopt or have adopted in order to have a say within the EU institutions. So the big question is really, do small states stand a chance to have a say in a union that consists of 28 members? Yep, it works like this. So I'm gonna divide my talks into 3 parts. First, I want to say a few words about the key concepts of the small states literature, vulnerability and capabilities, and the importance, from my point of view, that small leaders in small states acknowledge their limitations. Second, I want to present my findings on how small states try to overcome their limited administrative capacity within the EU compared with the larger states, and how they try to become proactive within the Union. I'm going to spend most time on this point. The more I study small states within the Union, the more I'm drawn to the importance of administrative competence within the small states. More on that in a moment. I mean, we look at the small states and the European Commission, negotiations of small states in the Council of Ministers and in the European Council. And then the third point has to do with the concepts of image and political will or political willingness, which I think are of importance as well. I think it is important, generally speaking, for the small state literature or the international relations literature in general to move away from the traditional variables most often used to define size of states and introduce new ones like administrative competence, image, and political will. And there is then a short summary in the end. So, first few words on small states. As Ulf already mentioned, it is quite tricky to define a small state. And first of all, I would like to say that we don't need a final definition of what constitutes a small state. It all depends on the comparison. What states are we comparing? Are we comparing Iceland to Germany, or are we comparing Iceland to Luxembourg? It makes all the difference. So we may have to define size of states according to each and every study. The traditional variables usually used to define size of states are population, or number of inhabitants, size of economy, military size, and size of territory. I would like to add the 5th variable, which I think is quite important, which I label as size and characteristics of the public administration, including the foreign service. Small states are generally said to be vulnerable, more vulnerable than larger states. This has to a large extent to do with the smallness of the domestic market. And because of the smallness of the domestic market, small markets tend to rely on import, rely on exports. They have to specialize in order to be competitive internationally. And if you look at the political aspect, as you all know, small states can't defend themselves from hostile attacks. They have smaller diplomatic services, and the big question is, again, how do they cope? How do they cope within the European Union with all these weaknesses, if I can say so? So there are certain economic problems, there are political problems, and one could say administrative problems, which needs to be overcome. And due to all of this, small states face structural disadvantages within the EU. And according to Diana Panke, who has done a lot of work on small states, structural disadvantages of small states in the day-to-day negotiations in the EU are based on voting power and bargaining capacity. We're basically talking about the fact that small states have fewer votes in the Council compared with the larger states. And even though decisions are most often taken by consensus, negotiations are done in the shadow of the possibility of a vote. And according to Panke, larger states have a greater say in the working groups and in Coreper and in the Council itself, the Council of Ministers. Secondly, according to Panke, small states are less able to offer side payments in bargaining within the Council. They have fewer financial and economic capabilities, which basically means that they are less powerful in economic terms, and this affects their position in negotiations. Then, thirdly, small states are less valuable coalition members. A willing coalition must have few bigger states, but quite many small states. And fourth and finally, small states have small public administration, smaller ministries, smaller delegations at the EU, smaller foreign services in general. They tend to lack expertise. They lack policy-specific expertise in many sectors. And all this affects them. So how can they compensate for their vulnerability? First of all, I would like to emphasize that leaders in small states have to acknowledge the limitations. Because if they don't acknowledge the limitations, they will not adopt the measures needed to overcome the vulnerability. And there are several ways of compensating for these weaknesses. There is they can make external arrangements, which is often discussed in international relations in general. Small states can form alliances. And this is what they do all the time. They can make bilateral arrangements or multilateral arrangement. Then they can make domestic arrangement, and we don't discuss this often in IR or small states literature. And this is the topic basically of today. And of course, of fundamental importance is good economic management, like in all states. Peter Katzenstein, a leading scholar in small states, wrote a lot about so-called democratic corporatism in specific Western European small states in the mid-80s. And he basically stated that the small states, by adopting this democratic corporatism, they adopted domestic buffer in order to compensate for the fluctuating international economy, because small states tend to be hit much harder during economic crisis. Another thing that small states can do is to become administrative competitive, develop a comprehensive, skillful, and efficient administration. And then later I'm going to mention the importance of image and political will. So there are several tools that small states can use to overcome or at least to compensate for their vulnerability. So how does a small state move from being reactive and become proactive? How and when does a small state come to the point that it considers it can contribute to the European Union? Not only defend its own interests, but become active within the Union, have a say on the overall development of a specific policy or the EU in general. And more is needed than a basic, well-functioning public administration and basic economic resources. More is needed. A state needs domestic administrative capacity and a decisive foreign service and adopt certain measures, which I'm going to mention in a moment, in order to become proactive within the EU. Just few more words on structural disadvantages of small states within the Union. Here I have figures, though they are from 2001, they show number of people working in foreign services of a number of European states. Most of these states now have now joined the European Union, and you see the enormous size difference in their foreign services. In 2001, there were about 2,000 officials working in the Luxembourgese foreign service. If you look at the 4 largest states here, they all had around or more than 5,000 officials working in their foreign services. And we have to answer the question, how do the smaller states cope? Is it possible for them to work efficiently and have a say within the Union? What do they do? How do they compensate for the smallness of their foreign service? And then we need to speak about the special characteristics, the special characteristics of small public administration. Let's first talk about the key word prioritization. It is of fundamental importance for small states to prioritize, to focus on issues that are of direct economic or political interest to them. And this is what small states do within the European Union. They focus on specific policy sectors. But they do more than that. They focus on special issues within particular policy sectors. Like Ireland mainly focuses on beef and milk within the common agricultural policy. That's where basically Irish interests are when it comes to agriculture. And there are 2 things to this. First, the small states need to prioritize. One could say they are forced to prioritize simply because of their limited capacity. And second, they can't prioritize because of the narrower range of interests within the European Union. Their interests are not as wide as in the larger states. They have more specific or specialized interests, and that's why they can afford to prioritize without damaging their stand within the Union. Then to the autonomy of officials of small states in Brussels. The officials in Brussels coming from small states, they participate in domestic policy making in ministries back home. At the same time, they make, if I can say so, they make domestic policies on the spot in Brussels. And they negotiate on the behalf of the state in Brussels. The larger states more often send expertise from their capital or negotiators from their capitals. The officials of small states have to be specialists in particular policy sectors. At the same time, they're forced to be generalists because they have to have a good overview of the whole EU, because there are not that many officials. To generalize, the officials of small states have a greater role than the counterparts from larger states. These officials, or from small states, when asked, they say they lack information from ministries back home. They lack clear objectives from back home. They often have to work without direct instructions from ministries back home. They have to find their own way through the EU decision-making structure. They're just, and they know what is expected of them, and they simply behave, operate accordingly. At the same time, they are not always required to contact their ministry back home. They can't do so easily and even talk to high-ranking officials if needed. And that is of fundamental importance when you need swift decisions or you need to consult someone back home who has the authority to alter decisions. And this basically means quicker and a more efficient decision-making process within the EU. So, generally speaking, the officials of small states have greater autonomy than their counterparts from the larger states, and they are expected to take initiatives. What helps them out enormously are the general characteristics of small public administrations, like informality and flexibility in decision making. This unofficial autonomy to take decisions. Decisions are often taken in informal meetings, over the telephone, by emails. There is a certain trust within small public administration. People tend to know each other. They've grown up together. They've been to the same schools. And I don't think we can underestimate this importance of trust and this close network within small public administration. However, when small states are dealing with very important issues, politically important or economically important, this may change and instruction become fairly strict from back home. But generally speaking, when they're working within the EU, the instructions are not that strict. And on the wider role of the officials, what I found fascinating when I was interviewing these officials in Brussels and in some of the member states' capitals was how some of the officials in small states touch on every single aspect of decision-making concerning the EU. So basically, the same official from a small state, he or she may participate in domestic decision-making. Then he or she may take part in working groups within the European Commission on behalf of the state. Then the official will turn up again in Brussels and negotiate on behalf of the state. He or she may take the final decision in a working group in the council, and the official may even advise the minister in the council. Then the official will turn up again within the framework of the European Commission and decide the criteria for implementation in one of the comitology committees. And then the same official may even occasionally be involved in implementing the directives back home. So they take part in all steps through from policy making to implementation. This never ever happens in a large states. In the larger states, in all the larger states, which are usually, when we talk about the larger states, we are of course talking about Germany, Britain, France, Italy, Spain, and Poland. There is a clear division between policy making, policy negotiations, and implementation, etc. Now to the Commission. How do small states work within the Commission? They, of course, use the methods which I've just described, but there is more can be said. First, small states tend to rely on the Commission, both in its committees and in the Council. They rely on it because in many sectors they don't have the capacity to gather enough information. So they rely on the Commission's information gathering. At the same time, if they need to press forward their own interests, they may rely on the Commission. They need the Commission to be with them. If a small state has the Commission with it, it stands a much better chance to press forward its issue or the issue. So what small states do, they cooperate with the Commission. They try to influence it on its initial stages when it's drawing up proposals. The larger states tend to be much more confrontational towards the Commission. They have the data, they have the information, they have the capacity to challenge the Commission in all occasions. These small states rarely do that. They try to work within it and work with the Commission. And if the small states find that the Commission is not with them, they will demand that the Commission act as a mediator between small and large states or between different interests. What helps small states within the Commission is the fact that there are only few officials in a small state responsible for a particular proposal. And the same is true within the Commission. The Commission isn't really this big bureaucracy. There are most often only 2 or 3 officials responsible for a particular proposal. So these officials from the small state on the one hand and from the Commission on the other tend to know each other. The officials within the Commission know what the small states needs. The smaller states are less complicated than the larger states. They have fewer interests to remember. So that it's easy to remember what they want. And there is often a close working relationship between these officials. And then the informality and the flexibility of the small public administration helps them enormously. The smaller states can respond quickly to new initiatives taken within the Commission. And this is what the Commission really likes. They really like not having to go through the complexity of the French bureaucracy or the British bureaucracy. I have labeled this work routine between officials of small states and the officials of the Commission as the routine working process. At the same time, it has to be stated that the Commission is not a defender of small states' interests. Small states have to fight their way through the Commission. They can't take it as given that the Commission will stand by it or stand by them. They have to prove that their ideas should be included in a particular proposal. At the same time, small states prefer to work within the Commission than to face 27 member states in the Council. It's much more difficult to get something through the Council than to get something through within the Commission. Because in the Council you face tough negotiations. More on that in a moment. And then the big question today is, are small states in a strong position within the Commission? As you all know, the president of the European Commission comes from one of the oldest small member states, Luxembourg. And within the Commission, there are 7 vice presidents. 6 out of 7 presidents come from small states. They come from Finland, Latvia, Slovakia, Estonia, Bulgaria, and the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken. The only exception is the High Representative from Italy. So 6 out of 7 vice presidents and the president himself. If we would turn the picture around and all these vice presidents and the president would come from the larger states, we would say that the larger states had taken over the Commission. So I think it's fair to conclude that the small states are in a especially strong position within the colleague of commissioners this term. Now, a few words on negotiations or negotiation tactics in the councils. To simplify, there are twofold negotiation approaches of small states in the councils. When the small states are dealing with sensitive topics of direct domestic interests, of course they play it tough. They adopt inflexible negotiation tactic. At the same time, they try to make a compromise early in the negotiations. They don't want to wait to the last minute, because then they are afraid to be locked in a corner and not get what they want. The reason being, the veto power of a small state is not taken as seriously as a veto power of a large state. So a small state doesn't want to have to use the veto power in case it's not taken seriously. And then the other negotiation tactic is basically a flexible negotiation approach on many occasions where the small state doesn't really have any direct economic or political interests. And there are so many issues that small states don't have any interest in, and they can play with this. So they really like the so-called EU package deals, when the EU combines lots of issues together and decides on them jointly. That's where the wheeling and dealing goes on. So the small state can be flexible on quite many items and simply state, we only need these, we only need 2 or 3 issues from this package deals. If you give it to us, we can be flexible on everything else. This makes it very easy for them, to form coalition and get and come to an agreement with the Commission. And I've sometimes spoken about the positive influence of small states within the EU bargaining, meaning that the small states basically only play tough when it comes to the direct interests. I mean, the larger states are playing tough all the time. It doesn't really matter where the issue affects them directly or not. They have an opinion. They state an opinion and they will fight for it. That's simply how they behave. That's how their foreign services operate. The culture of consensus helps enormously within the council, but again, as I mentioned, according to Panke, decisions or negotiations take place in shadow of votes. Let's now move to the European Council, where the head of governments meet. There is not much work on this closed club. We don't basically know much about how the leaders behave within the room. However, Jonas Thalberg and Maria Strömvik did an extremely interesting study 10 years ago when they interviewed a number of present and past leaders in the European Council. They did not ask any direct questions about size of states or concerning small states and large states. Thalberg has published few papers on this, but Maria has recently gone through the transcripts of the interviews again and basically discovered that the leaders of small and large states are constantly talking about the concept of size without being asked about it. And Maria and I are now working on this from the small states point of view. So I just want to mention some preliminary findings from Maria after she went through these transcripts again. First, She claims that size affects veto. The threat of a veto is not as scary from a small state as a large state. And to give you some direct quotations from the interviews, I quote, Luxembourg can issue a veto once in a decade, Britain once per week. Another direct quotation, the veto of Cyprus is not the same as the veto of Germany. Second, size affects spontaneity. At the negotiation table, large states may sometimes use the tactic of suggesting entirely new initiatives. They may come up with new issues on the spot. This does rarely happen in the case of the small states, because if they take initiative in the room, come up with something new, they are immediately put down and told they are not cooperative. Third, size affects patience, according to Maria Strömvik. The more formalized the European Council meetings become, the more often it happens that there are two empty chairs in the room. The chairs of France and the chair of Germany. And the leaders of these big states will leave the room and negotiate separately. They will come to an agreement outside the room and present the outcome to the others. Fourthly, size affects time. And it's interesting, there seems to be, in a way, some kind of self-perception of smallness amongst the leaders from the small countries. They claim that if needed, the leaders from the large states can't talk as long and demand as much as they want. But the leaders from the small states, they have to stick to the timetable. They have to stick to the minutes they are supposed to speak. So they feel that they are representing fewer people, the leaders from the small states. Fifthly, and finally, size affects language. Some of the leaders from the small state claimed that the leaders of the larger states, they speak differently at the table. The German chancellor will say, Germany thinks. The president of France will say, France thinks. When it comes to the leaders of the small states, they will never speak like that. They will say something like, I would like to submit to your consideration. It's all about the impression you give. This, again, self-perception of whether or not you feel you are coming from a big state or a small state. But then, when is size less important? Size is less important in the council if a head of a government in a small state is knowledgeable, is experienced, is competent, charismatic, with excellent negotiation skills, and is willing to put the common European good, a common European interest above his or her own interests. Then the leader can become quite successful. But these features all together are don't really often come in a package. So, according to these primary findings, the Council, or the European Council, is a tough place for the small countries. The larger states run the show, they run the game. And the small states leaders gave the impression that they are basically sometimes treated badly within the Council. They are not taken seriously, even though when they are trying to take initiatives. So that's why I spent so much time previously on the European Commission, because I think that's the area where small states can exercise their influence. So now to the few words on these concepts of image and political will or political willingness. So a state may become active or influential within the council if it uses these features which I just mentioned, like knowledge, diplomatic skills, and is able to take initiatives. But I would say more is needed in order for a small country to have a say within a particular policy sector. A few issues regarding this. First of all, states have to have a political will to have a say. They have to decide to be active. They have to believe that they can have a say within the union. If you don't believe that you can have a say, I mean, you may not even try to have a say. You have to believe in the decision-making structure, that you can work within it, and that you can work with others. And some states may even lack this belief in the EU structure or in their public administration. This, according to some academics, this is, for example, the case of Slovenia today, which, according to some academics, simply follows the flow and doesn't really try to take initiatives. So the state in question needs to be willing to spend time, effort, and money on working within the European Union. It helps to be seen as a norm setter in a particular policy fields such as environmental protections. And as you all know, the Nordic states are sometimes seen as norm setters or norm entrepreneurs in a number of fields. And when it comes to the EU's environmental policy, this has helped them enormously. For example, according to a recent study by Gunnhildur Magnúsdóttir, which basically claims that Denmark, Sweden, and Finland have been able to use their positive image when it comes to environmental protection to have a say within the EU's environmental policy. And then we are speaking about the perception of others, which is as well very important from my point of view. How do the other actors regard the state? If they believe that the state is successful domestically, for example, on environmental protection, because we are talking about it, if they believe that the state has something to say about it, if they believe that the state is an expertise when it comes to environmental protection, they will listen more carefully. They will take the state seriously. They will not basically regard the state as a small state or as a small actor. Because a small state can grow in size or can have a say if it demonstrates knowledge and has something to contribute. So understanding goodwill, trust, and the belief in the knowledge of the states makes all the difference when it comes to tough negotiations in the Council. And now to the summary, and if you go back to our original question, how can a little frog fly? First of all, our little frog has to acknowledge its limitations. Our little frog needs to accept the fact that it cannot fly. That said, the little frog can jump quite high and far with considerable practice. And in order to do so, the little frog or our small state need administrative competence. It needs political will and favorable image in order to become active within the EU decision making and in order to tackle constraints associated with smallness. Having a say within the EU is not all about the EU's structure of decision making. It's as well about domestic features within small states or within states, domestic features of the public administration. So basically speaking, from my point of view, the size and characteristics of the public administration is of importance in explaining the ability of states to have a say within the Union. And I think it's fair to say that the larger states have, generally speaking, created the overall framework of the European Union, or at least they've been more influential when it comes to creating the framework of the European Union. At the same time, the smaller states have demonstrated that they can't defend their interest within this framework created by the larger states. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Baldur. I'll just position myself over here, and please, you can stay up there. And now we open the floor for general discussion. But before we do that, could I take the opportunity to say just a few words?
Yes, please do.
Because I think you made a very interesting overview, and I agree with a lot of the things that you said. And you say that basically that size matters, but some small states are smaller than others, and size matters more in some institutional settings than in others, right? More or less, perhaps in the Council or the European Council than in the Commission. Reminds me about the political parties. You know, in Norway we have some smaller parties and some bigger parties, and some of the smaller parties, for instance, the Center Party. They have always been very efficient, clever negotiators. And maybe some bigger parties would dream of becoming a smaller, more efficient party. Anyway, just 2 points. First, you say something about the importance of separating between different institutional settings. But what I would like to encourage you to reflect upon is, what if we separate between different policy areas? Is it so that they are more influential in some policy areas than in others? So one is economic policy, energy policy, etc. So that's the first point. The second point, for instance, military, foreign affairs, those kind of issues, is so the small states play a less significant role in those areas than in others. So that's where's the policy dimension. The other question relates to one of the things that we wrote about in this Norwegian EU review, because we separated between areas where you have more or less similar preferences, where, for instance, Norway want to be involved in EU policy making, but there's not big conflict between the EU and Norway, right? And typically the observation is that in such situations, Norway is included in decision making, have joint kind of discussions, etc. But in areas where we have opposite preferences, it's very difficult for smaller states. So it's about the preference structure and intensity of the preferences. So is it so that smaller states are included more in areas where there are pretty much consensus? It's easier for smaller states, where when there is conflict, small states are excluded. You see my point?
First, I completely agree with you when it comes to different policy areas and the ability of small countries to have a say. And as you stated, when it comes to security and defense, smaller states probably have less say within the Union than the larger states. Then we are talking about military capacity, a policy fields that the larger states are not so easily going to give up. And of course, the larger states have much more capacity, capabilities, and can contribute to in a much greater scale than the smaller states. And because we were speaking about the environmental policy, I mean, I mentioned how the three Nordic EU members have used their positive image in the environmental field to have a say within the Union. At the same time, some academics will claim that the Nordic states will not go very far if they can't ally themselves with Germany when it comes to environmental protection. But if the Nordic states manage to ally themselves with Germany, I mean, the issue goes through. So they will try to cooperate closely with Germany, where environmental protection is high on the agenda. No, I mean, there are tough negotiations, which makes a big difference for small states in areas like in the day-to-day decision making within the EU, like concerning agriculture or regional development or the structural funds. And the smaller states often have to play quite tough. And they manage to do so. And then, of course, there is a certain understanding within the EU of the position of the small states. I mean, within the EU, everyone knows what Ireland needs concerning regional development. They will know what Ireland needs when it comes to agriculture. And there's basically some understanding and consensus that you have to satisfy Irish interests in order to have the Irish on board. And I mean, it's difficult to measure this and say Ireland is that influential, 27%. It's impossible. It's more like this, and here comes in the importance of the culture of consensus when it comes to decision making in the EU, which is of enormous value within the EU. And even though most decisions today can't be taken by qualified majority voting within the Council, most decisions are still taken by consensus. And this helps out. So even though small states face difficult negotiation within the Council, I think they can often press forward with their issues. Of course, then they need to give in. They will not get everything. They need to ally themselves with the Commission and some of the other member states, form coalitions.
Okay, let's have an open up for discussion. Okay, Tom first, and then Pernille.
Thank you. Very interesting talk and so many plausible arguments.
Yes.
It was quite interesting to listen to. So thank you. I would like to talk about the concept of administrative capacity, because you only talk about the foreign service, if I got you correct.
Mm-hmm.
But as you know, a government consists of so many other different ministries. And I think Ulf kind of alluded to it when he talked about different policy dimensions. Because in different policy dimensions, you have different ministries operating. So it would be very interesting to get some perspectives on administrative capacity when you actually differentiate between the different ministries. So, for instance, some countries can have really good ministries of trade, while others can have really good ministries of finance, or have an image at least of being really good and being really well prepared when they go to the Commission, when they participate in the different comitology groups and so on. So I would like to hear if you have some reflections on that issue.
Yes. Because we are, for example, on Ireland, I mean, like 10 or 20 years ago in Ireland, what mattered for Ireland within the EU was to get a good deal on agriculture and the regional policy. So Ireland would simply prioritize these two areas, like Luxembourg today prioritizes the financial sector. And so the small states will develop, if I can say, administrative competence in these policy sectors. They will try to do their most to develop knowledge, become skillful negotiations in these sectors, and leave simply others on the sides because they don't really have that many direct interests when it comes to other other areas or other ministries. And then another thing that indicates the capacity of the small states to cope with the EU demands is the fact that the smaller states don't have greater difficulties in implementing the EU law, the EU rules, than the larger states. There is not greater implementation deficit within the small countries compared with the larger ones. So that's an interesting thing. So I would say the smallest states will try to develop administrative competence where needed. Then, of course, you may have states like Greece, which is administratively weak, to say the least, and basically has not been able to work efficiently, not at home when it comes to EU domestic policy making, and not been able to work efficiently when it comes to negotiations in the EU institutions in Brussels. But then, of course, we are dealing with weak administrative structure back home, which has had its consequences. I'm not sure if this answers your questions, but try.
I'm just saying that maybe foreign service isn't the best proxy all the time to measure the administrative capacity of a country.
Yes, yeah, of course, that's true. You need to bring other ministries in. But though at the same time, when dealing with the EU, the foreign service is most involved with the EU, though it, of course, cooperate closely with other ministries.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I just wonder if, because it's common to argue that the enlargement process has led to a change in the balance between the larger and the smaller state in favor of the smaller states. And I wonder if you agree with that, if that is the kind of the case in general, that the smaller states has been more influential in the EU. And my second question is, do you really think that the flexibility and the pragmatism of smaller state could really compete with the kind of professionalism and expertise of the larger states? And if you have any concrete examples that you can refer to where the kind of smaller states have gained influence because of this flexibility and trust that you refer to. Thank you.
Yeah, on the EU enlargement and the new treaties, I think at least the media has often overstated the consequences for small states of the EU enlargement and the new treaties, like the Lisbon Treaty. From my point of view, the ability to have a say within the Union has more to do with administrative competence, again, rather than the basic EU structure of decision-making. And I don't think the EU structure of decision-making has changed that much. It's still based on consensus. The Commission is still doing its ordinary day-to-day work. So the landscape has not changed that radically. At the same time, it is more difficult to operate within a union that consists of 28 states, especially if you compare it with the union that only consisted of 6 states or 12 states, like it did for a long time. That makes things more difficult, especially for small administration. We have to admit that. But how can they compensate for this? Again, I'm drawn back to the administrative competence, the informality and the flexibility. That's the only way for them to cope. Because proportionally, they don't have more people working in the public sector than the larger states. Proportionally, smaller states don't have a bigger foreign service compared with the larger states. So we should not overestimate the effect of the enlargement and the new treaties. Though, from my point of view, what is dangerous for small states, is that if the EU institutions are not strong enough, if they are so weak that they don't produce an outcome, they can't solve sensitive issues, deal with sensitive topics, then the larger states will simply leave the negotiation room and negotiate separately behind closed doors and present the outcome to the others. So I would say the fundamental importance for small states is to have strong institutions that can deal and solve sensitive issues. Because if the institutions don't do it, the larger states will do it on their own. And,
Yeah.
So, yeah, please go ahead.
I think just, I thought you were finished now. So I just wanted to say this, what you're saying now, I think is extremely important. So that's why I'm probably not in the, not your argument, but what the Diana Pianke
Yes.
is arguing, that there's some structural disadvantage within the EU. But that's a bit wrong way of putting it. I think there are lots of structural advantages for small states of having the EU. But maybe within the construction there are some problems, right? But maybe you were not finished on the second point.
The second part, or your second question concerning if I could demonstrate examples when small states have used this flexibility informality to have a say. I mean, number of examples. I mean, even when it comes to the regional policy of the EU, the smaller states, whether or not they are developed or undeveloped, have very specific interest within it. Most often they only need to be included in one part of the structural funds policies or get support from one funds within the structural policy. And they have on a number of occasions, Ireland, even Belgium and Denmark, basically said to the Commission when it comes to regional affairs, I mean, we only need access to this fund, or we only need to be part of objective one area within the regional policy. We will be flexible on all other occasions. We will accept whatever you say about the reforming the regional policy if you only provide this small thing we need. And the Commission has often gone along with this kind of a deal. The same is when it comes to agriculture. The smaller states have much narrower range of interest within agriculture. They maybe have direct interest in like 7 to 10 products that fall under the CAP out of like 25 to 30 products altogether. And they would basically say, I mean, we only need this, this, and that. On the rest of the issues, do what you please. We will be flexible. So this makes them able to not only to form a coalition with the Commission, makes it easy for them to form a coalition with the other members. And they use this all the time in negotiations. That's why they like so much these package deals. Sorry, Ulf. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Thanks. I'm thinking about an argument that's been floated, like a major intervening variable when we talk about small state policy has been the after effects of the global financial crisis and more specifically the Eurozone emergency. This has led to the argument over whether being a small state, could be considered an asset or a liability. On one hand, you have the argument that's frequently been used, the whole idea of hanging together or hanging separately. But on the other hand, there's been suggestions that being small, you have the advantage of flexibility, as was noted. You have the ability to basically go out and look for, let's say, non-orthodox solutions to dealing with the various economic crises. This argument has been brought up in the case of Iceland, and it was omnipresent during the entire Scotland referendum debate. So I was wondering if you can comment on how much of an intervening variable to your studies is Europe's economic situation. Thanks.
I've mainly been looking at the economic situation in Iceland, which is in as much is not more in need of considerations concerning its economy. But there are, I mean, like Ulf said, there are certain advantages associated with smallness. At the same time, I think, in generally speaking, the academic literature during the boom years, it overlooked the vulnerability of small states, the weaknesses associated with the smallness of the domestic market. And from my point of view, small states need to overcome their weaknesses. They need to accept the fact that they need economic shelter and political shelter. They need protecting power if they want to have a proper defense, if they are threatened by others. They need to form an alliances in order to defend themselves. The same is the case when it comes to economic development. They need either access to the common market, which basically is in a way a shelter for a small market that basically survives on import and export and is not sustainable on its own. So I would say back home in Iceland, our political leaders at present, they don't accept the fact that we need economic shelter. They think they can do it on their own. Of course, there are different perspectives of this, but I think we need, that's why I emphasize this vulnerability and these weaknesses, because if we don't acknowledge them, we will not adopt necessary measures to overcome them.
Okay, but can I challenge you a bit more to continue? Yes. Because I made this joke about political parties and maybe some would like to become smaller. But there's some seriousness here as well as a follow-up to Mark, saying that, okay, in Italy, you see separatist movements. In Spain, you see separatist movement. You see it in the UK. We see that also in other European countries. So, based upon your research, would somehow you recommend then for Barcelona, Catalonia to become more separate, independent? Are they faring better as a small state? Would the Scots fare better within the EU as a small state? Would a region in Italy do that? It's because there's this discussion, and I think one of the arguments for separatism is, of course, that you want to have increase adaptability, have more closeness, and also be flexible to global markets, etc.
Good question. And in fact, I wrote a paper on Scotland as a potential small independent state. The two colleagues of mine in Iceland, it got quite some attention in Scotland before the referendum. And the interesting thing about Scotland was that, of course, the Scottish nationalists wanted independence, but at the same time, they were going to keep what I refer to as the present shelter that Scotland already enjoys. The Scottish National Party changed its opinion on NATO membership, so they were going to stay within NATO, and they were going to continue to be part of the European Union. At the same time, they were going to hold on to the British pound as an item of economic shelter. And we claimed in this paper that Scotland could fare well on its own, taking the fact that the Scots were going to be fully integrated in European economy and defense. The case of Catalonia, I think, is quite different. It's more complicated, it's more difficult, because it may become quite difficult for Catalonia as a small independent state to join the European Union simply because of opposition from Madrid. It all depends on how Madrid plays it. If Madrid plays it tough, it's going to be tough in Barcelona. The thing with Scotland was that this was the referendum and all that was done in a quite friendly manner with London and Westminster. But I have no doubt that the regions like Scotland and Catalonia can operate on their own, become independent states, if they accept the fact that they need shelter and they can leave their states peacefully and get support from them. Because the Scots were wanted to keep part of their shelter, like the pound and the Queen.
Yeah, we can please signal if you want to jump in here. But could I ask? There are lots of questions that arise from this, because you have said that size is a factor, of course. But we can imagine that this is not just a continuum, but there are some kind of threshold factors here, kind of states under, let's say, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, 7 million. they are not so efficient. But states that are between, let's say, 5 and 15 are very efficient, and then they become kind of, you lose out some economies of scale, for instance, if they become very big. Right, so I don't know if you treat this as just either small or not so small, or if you see this as a kind of continuum. So that's one point. The other point, I think, if we were to kind of transfer some of the lessons that I learned from you today to a more critical decision the EU is facing now on sanctions, right? It's a unanimity decision in the EU. And we have already heard in the news that some smaller states are less willing to go on with the sanctions. Based upon your kind of assessment here, would that matter? Or will kind of this be determined by some of the bigger states? So will unanimity somehow matter? But before you respond to it, let's hear from Christoph.
Thanks. Thank you very much for a very insightful seminar. I had a question that was very much connected to that, and that's connected to the more general question of the type of influence that you're talking about. I'm not quite sure I fully grasped the notion of influence for the purpose of your very compelling demonstration. What kind of influence are you talking about? Is this a positive influence in the sense that in order for a small member state to have an influence in the sense of achieving policy goals, it has to meet the requirements that you have identified? Would that be the same for having influence in a much more negative way? And that connects to what Ulf is saying. In a unanimity setting, it's very, very easy for a small member state to have an influence. I mean, if the EU is to continue to maintain its sanctions against Russia, it needs the backup of Hungary, which might not give it. If the EU wants to have very tough regulations on the banking system, it needs the backup of Luxembourg, which it did not have for a very long time. So the influence of Luxembourg was quite major in the process of establishing a regulatory framework for the banking system in the EU. So what type of influence really are you talking about? May I just ask another question, which is more connected to the application of your approach to big member states? I was actually wondering whether a big member state would have any influence in the EU without meeting all the requirements that you have identified. I mean, if France wants to be influential, it pretty much has to meet most of the requirements you have identified. If it wants to be listened to, I mean, of course, from time to time, France can have, the empty chair policy, or, can shout a couple of times in the European Council. But if it really wants to achieve influence, it will have to meet the requirements you have identified. So the question, I suppose, is what makes those requirements specific to small states' influence compared to what the requirements would be for a bigger member state to have influence?
Yep. To start with your last point, I'm not so sure that a large state need to hold all these characteristics which I mentioned, which I think are fundamentally important for small states. For example, I studied the GATT negotiations in the mid-90s. For over a year, France used its veto in the EU to delay a GATT deal. It simply said, no, 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 and it was taken seriously all the time. It didn't really have to do much, I mean, it didn't have to try to be cooperative. It didn't have to use inflexibility or informality or being friendly to anyone. It simply said no.
But that's 20 years ago.
Yes, but I think it still does that. When Portugal tried to do this 20 years ago, it managed to delay the GATT deal by 24 hours. And then it was compensated, it got bought off by the EU. When it comes to sanctions today against Russia, I mean, if France says no, it is no within the European Council. I mean, if Germany says no to sanctions against Russia, there are going to be no sanctions. A veto is a veto from these big players. They don't have to be cooperative if they don't want to be cooperative. When it comes to Hungary, their veto, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what is going on within the EU regarding this, but the veto threat from the smaller Eastern members are not taking us seriously. I guess they will, if they are against it, they are bought off in one way or another. They will be compensated by one way or another, even through the back door. That's how they are bought off. And I am sure they really hesitate to use the veto when it comes to sanction against Russia, simply because you don't want to place your veto on the table and no one takes it seriously. Because if that happens, the veto might be gone almost forever. So the smaller states, they don't really do that.
Take Greece in the enlargement context. That's a counterexample.
Yes, that's true. Greece has managed to block. Has to block, and there are some issues. There are some issues like that. Yes, Cyprus, Greece, Turkey. Yes, definitely. Then.
And Luxembourg on the financial regulations.
Yes, and that's where I was going to come on. What I'm talking about is specific policy outcomes. Like for Luxembourg. Luxembourg has an idea how it wants to see EU's financial structure in order to protect its financial sector. And in a way, it's remarkable how much Luxembourg has perceived over the years. It has been able to keep its specific financial or banking sector intact. That's in a way remarkable. And of course, it may have to do, it has of course to do with it has not to do with the veto, it more has to do with the culture of consensus, the understanding that Luxembourg needs a good deal on the financial sector. It has more to do with the cultural consensus and her understanding towards a small state and what a small state needs. I doubt that Luxembourg is placing the veto on the table all the time. I don't think they do that. That's going to be too sensitive. And so Luxembourg, I would say, is in a really great need of using these tactics, which I was mentioning in my lecture, in order to succeed. Because if it was Germany who wanted to preserve its financial sector, it could skip all of them, if I simplify it, and place the veto on the table. Luxembourg can't do that. So I'm talking about a specific policy outcome in regional affairs or agriculture or environmental protection. And then, I mean, small states are basically only dealing with interests of direct domestic interests, most often direct economic domestic interests. But sometimes they're dealing with hot political topics. If I can say that environmental protection, it is a hot political topic in some member states. That's why it's important for some politicians.
Okay, thank you. And then I don't see any more hands. So thank you so much, Baldur, for coming here, sharing your thoughts with us. I think what you have very convincingly argued is that all states are not equal. Some are larger and some are smaller, right? And so size matters. But you have also helped us to understand a bit more about how it matters and in which instances it matters in different institutional settings. But you also kind of added to our understanding of size, and not only this territorial population, but also put an emphasis on the image, the political willingness, and administrative capability. I think that's a very important kind of lessons. And you also told us a lot about the strategies states can pursue in order to compensate or to utilize some of its weaknesses and turn them into strengths. But at the same time, I think that, and you have raised this yourself, that there are also some challenges with the concept of size. And it's difficult to how to deal with it. But so thank you so much for your good presentation and rich overview, and also a lovely discussion and contribution in the discussion. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Thank you.